Good evening, my friends. I hope this message reaches you somewhere quiet tonight, maybe under a dim light, maybe after a long day, when the noise of the world finally fades. Because what you're about to hear isn't breaking news. It's something deeper, a story the world tried to overlook, yet one that refuses to disappear. Far from the polished streets of power and the glare of global cameras, in the heart of West Africa, something extraordinary is happening. In the small town of Boucle du Mouhoun, a place once erased from maps and memories, the wind carries new sounds not of fear, but of awakening. For years, it was a corridor of despair. Farmers fled their land, schools turned silent, and the night sky belonged not to stars, but to gunfire. And then, from the dust of a country the world had written off, a voice rose. That voice belonged to President Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader who spoke with the gravity of someone twice his years. He didn't speak of alliance or dependency. He said simply, security must come from within. It was not a slogan, it was a challenge to his people and to the world. From that moment, Burkina Faso began to write its own chapter, a story not of submission, but of sovereignty. A story born not in marble halls or conference rooms, but in the red earth of forgotten villages. The operation that followed would test the nation's strength like never before. The plan was clear, though heavy with risk. Retake, restore, reclaim. At dawn, the first wave moved. The mobile intervention units, trained for speed and silence, slipped through the brushlands of Boucle du Mouhoun. They were shadows in motion, guided by courage and conviction. When the first strike came, it didn't just shatter enemy strongholds, it broke months of paralysis. In that instant, silence gave way to purpose. Behind them came the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, the VDP. They were not trained soldiers. They were farmers, herders, merchants, men who once plowed soil, now carrying rifles instead of tools. They didn't fight for glory. They fought for the right to return home. They moved through villages like whispers, cutting off retreating militants, reclaiming what had once been theirs: grain, wells, roads, dignity. To the north and west, elite units followed. The Gepard and Phantom forces swept through fortified positions, guided by real-time intelligence. Each strike was deliberate. Each movement measured. High-value targets were captured, stockpiles seized, communications severed. Every kilometer retaken was not just ground won, it was a heartbeat returning to a nation once thought lost. Above them, technology played its quiet role. Drones hovered over dry riverbeds and forests, scanning for heat and movement. Through their lenses, entire networks of militants were exposed. Coordinates relayed. Missiles released. In seconds, convoys that once roamed with impunity were reduced to silence. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso wasn't reacting, it was anticipating. The final advance came from the Rapid Intervention Battalions, BIR 7 and BIR 18. They moved through reclaimed zones with precision, securing, stabilizing, ensuring no returning cell could find shelter. They gathered abandoned weapons, confiscated fuel, and turned the remnants of war into symbols of resistance. When the campaign ended, dozens of insurgent bases were destroyed, hundreds of weapons reclaimed, and thousands of civilians freed from fear. But the victory that mattered most was unseen. It was the quiet dignity that returned to those who had been told they were forgotten. In Boucle du Mouhoun, a flag rose again. Its colors danced in the wind over land that once belonged to terror. That moment was not merely symbolic, it was sacred. It said, "We are still here." The world took notice. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso wasn't a cautionary headline, it was an example. In Mali and Niger, voices rose in admiration. Across Africa, analysts called it the dawn of indigenous security, a doctrine built not on dependence, but on dignity. And yet, in the corridors of Western power, the tone was different. They called it bold. They called it risky. Some called it defiant. But for the people of Boucle du Mouhoun, It was simply justice delayed. When President Traoré visited the liberated zones, he didn't arrive in grandeur. He arrived in dust and humility. He shook hands with volunteers still wearing worn boots and tired faces. He spoke softly, not as a commander addressing subordinates, but as one of them. The cameras captured no spectacle, only sincerity. In those moments, he wasn't the president of a nation. He was a son among his people. As celebrations spread, so did scrutiny. Human rights observers questioned civilian safety. Western outlets ran cautious headlines urging restraint. Diplomats debated in distant capitals about oversight and command. But inside Burkina Faso, the conversation was different. They weren't asking for validation. They were asking for peace. When pressed by international critics, Traoré's words were calm, unwavering. The world must understand we fight for existence, not ambition. His statement wasn't defiance. It was truth, spoken by a nation long denied the right to stand alone. Soon after, a video emerged volunteers at dawn, standing in formation as the flag rose over Boucle du Mouhoun. Their faces were lined with loss, their eyes steady. They saluted not power, but promise. In their silence, they said everything. That freedom earned is heavier than freedom given. In cafes across Ouagadougou, people began to talk differently, no longer in despair, but in debate. Could this doctrine's security from within truly sustain a nation? Could local defense become a foundation for peace, not just protection? Questions filled the air, but this time, they were questions born of ownership, not hopelessness. The campaign's aftermath became its second act. The same battalions that had fought began rebuilding. They cleared roads, reopened trade routes, and restored bridges scarred by years of war. Trucks that once carried ammunition now carried food and medicine. Welders turned shell fragments into farming tools. Every act of repair carried the same quiet defiance. We are not waiting for help. Families returned in convoys of battered pickups. Children clung to what little remained of home. Some found only ruins, and yet they smiled, because ruins can be rebuilt. In fields once burned black, farmers planted again. The first crops became offerings, not to wealth, but to survival. And when the markets reopened, when drums replaced gunfire, the sound was not just music, it was proof that life had returned. At the heart of this renewal stood a single idea that sovereignty is not an abstract word, but a living discipline. President Traoré turned that belief into policy. Gold exports were restructured, mining concessions reviewed. Funds once flowing outward began flowing inward toward defense, education, and reconstruction. Critics abroad called it nationalism. Supporters called it justice. In his speech from Ouagadougou, Traoré said, "Our gold must first protect our people, not enrich others." The message was simple, the meaning immense. Across Africa, those words echoed. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Accra, people began to whisper, "If Burkina Faso can stand, so can we." To Western observers, it sounded like rebellion. To Africans, it sounded like self-respect. But independence is never without cost. Foreign aid slowed. Diplomatic ties cooled. Reports of friction appeared across European networks. Yet inside the country, resilience deepened. Burkina Faso had chosen the harder road, the lonelier one, but it was theirs. As months passed, the rhythm of life returned to Boucle du Mouhoun. Children played in schoolyards once used as shelters. Traders filled the air with laughter and bargaining. And at the edge of one village, an old man stood by the road at dusk, lighting a lantern. When a journalist asked why he still kept watch, he said softly, "Because the light is new, and the darkness does not forget. You have a one friend day." It was not just a sentence. It was a warning, a promise, a truth. Victory, after all, is not the end. It's the beginning of responsibility. In the halls of global power, analysts debated what had just happened. In Washington, Paris, and Brussels, Commentators described it as the Burkina Faso paradox, a small landlocked nation cut off from major powers, defying odds, and succeeding where larger coalitions had failed. Some praised its courage, others feared its example. On PBS, one analyst asked quietly, "What happens when Africa no longer asks for permission to defend itself?" That question hung in the air, heavier than statistics, louder than politics. Because this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about the shifting weight of history itself. For generations, the story of Africa had been told through the voices of others. Now, those voices were being replaced by their own. In Mali and Niger, banners were raised beside the Burkinabé flag. Crowds chanted, "One people, one defense." The African Union spoke of indigenous security, a model for a new era. But in Europe, concern grew. Editorials warned of isolation, of unpredictability, of drift. Yet for those on the ground in Boucle du Mouhoun, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the fields were green again, that the air smelled of rain, not smoke, that children laughed where silence once ruled. And as night settled over the Sahel, one could almost hear the continent breathing. Slowly, painfully, but freely. The road ahead remains uncertain. Insurgents still lurk in the north. Economies strain under sanctions. And the path of self-reliance will demand sacrifice. But beneath it all lies a steady conviction that even if the journey is long, it will be theirs. Boucle du Mouhoun is no longer a wound. It is a scar, one that speaks, one that endures. A reminder that strength, once found, can never be forgotten. So tonight, as the stars rise over West Africa, remember this. A nation once dismissed has redefined its destiny. Its people, once scattered, now stand unbroken. And its leader, once underestimated, has proven that courage can be contagious. Because sometimes, the smallest nations cast the longest shadows. And when a people refuse to kneel, the world must decide. Do we see defiance? Or do we finally see dignity? Tell me, my friends. When the forgotten find their voice, when the silenced begin to speak, when a flag once buried in dust rises again, is that the sound of danger? Or the sound of freedom finding its breath? If stories like this move you, stay with us. Because this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a continent remembering itself.